start and maybe others will join us. Hi everybody, my name is Libby O'Neill. I am the director of the Boyden Library. Thank you so much for coming out on this rainy night to kick off celebrating National Poetry Month. We have Sara Letourneau here. I'll do a brief introduction. I know she'll do a better job with her introduction, but I will at least kick it off. Sara's debut poetry collection, Wild Gardens, which we do have a copy at the library, and then Sara will be selling and signing some this evening. She is also a book editor and a writing coach at Heart of the Story Editorial and Coaching Services, and the co-founder and co-host of Pour Me a Poem Open Mic in Mansfield. And the co-editor of Pour Me a Poem Poetry Anthology. Her poetry has won the 2023 Beals Prize for Poetry and the Blue Institute's 2020 Words of Water contest. Let's see. And she is from right here in Foxboro. So Sara, thank you so much for coming tonight, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hello, everybody. How are you doing tonight? Good. I'm so glad that you're here for tonight's event and to celebrate National Poetry Month. Are we all poets or poetry lovers here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. Yay, awesome. I want to take a moment before I get too far into my poetry reading / author talk, just to thank Libby and Boyden Library for hosting this event. I mean, when you're a brand new author, you don't always know what to expect when you inquire about things like, can I do a reading in my hometown library? And so I did. So I really appreciate this, and the excitement that you've had about this event, I really have appreciated it. And as a show of appreciation tonight, one of the things, if you are interested in doing it tonight, is we have a container available for donations for Boyden Library, or specifically Friends of Boyden Library. Betsy, do you want to take a moment right now to talk about what Friends of Boyden Library does?
Absolutely, because when you say Friends of Library, people say, we're all friends of the library, we love our library. But it does get a little bit more organized than that. The Friends of the Library is basically like the booster club for the library. If you've had kids in school, you're familiar with what booster clubs do. So much of what this wonderful library does, and I have to tell you, I've seen libraries hither and yon, and for a small town, this is an amazing library and has great resources and provides wonderful things to the community. But so much of what they provide is not covered just in the municipal or the state budget. There's all these extras, things like programming, wonderful programs, some of the Library of Things that you can check out. A lot of money for different things in the children's department, like craft supplies and the little extras that go with the story times and things like that. That's not provided. So what we do, our main mission is to raise funds that then in turn directly go back to the library to pay for all of those little extras that make this such a special place and that provide all these wonderful things for the community. So I really want to thank Sara for thinking of us and thinking of the library specifically and asking for or suggesting donations, not required at all. She's got a beautiful little jar back there. The main thing I do want to say is if you do feel like donating, and if you give a certain amount of money, you might as well become a friend of the library while you do it. We have different tiers of membership, starting at $10 a year if you're a senior or a student, and going up from there. The nice thing about that is you'll have a membership for a year that then in turn goes back to the library. You also get a few little benefits, like for our, I don't know if anybody comes to our biannual book sales. Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, they're great, aren't they? If you are a friend of the library, you get one free book, and you also get early access to that all-important bag sale at the end of the library. Stuff a bag for a very nominal fee and walk off with it. So there are certain benefits for that, but the main benefit is if you become a member, you are directly supporting the library and then the community of Foxboro. And I like to think of it this way. If you attend only one program a year, something as wonderful as this, you have already made up your dues because all of our programming is free. And if you did these same kind of programs out in the community, you'd probably be spending $20 to $25 minimum to get in. So just a thought, next to the jar up there, there's going to be some brochures and a little membership envelope if you are so inclined. And if you have any questions about it, you can see me afterwards. But again, Sarah, thank you so much for thinking of us.
Very much.
It's wonderful.
You are welcome. And, you know, one of the reasons why I was thinking of the library is because, as Libby was saying earlier, I'm a resident. I'm a longtime resident, actually. My family moved here in 1996, so I'm a Foxboro High graduate as well. I graduated in 2003. I still live here in town, and so the fact that I have a book out and also doing something here at Boyden Library is kind of surreal tonight. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some poems from Wild Gardens. And as I do that, I'm going to share some of the behind-the-scenes stories of those poems to give you some insight into, you know, personally what went into this collection, but also some insights in how to create a poetry collection, because that was very much a learning experience for me. This is my very first one. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to kick it off with one of my favorite poems in the book. It's also the first poem in Wild Gardens. Oh, I should show you what the book looks like too. Thank you. We're going to talk about the cover art later. But for now, how many people here have spent time on Cape Cod, either summer vacations or lots of people? Awesome. I'm just like you, and there are several Cape Cod poems in the book, and this is one of them. An origin story of Cape Cod. Let's start at the beginning. 23,000 years ago. Your parents were the Earth and Laurentide, an ice sheet stretching from the Arctic Ocean all the way to what would later be known as the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. If anyone had borne witness, they would have found a cold crust of white as far as the eye could see. This didn't happen all at once, of course. Patience is both virtue and necessary evil when you need about 5 centuries to emerge. But not once did you complain as leisurely your more glacial parent retreated north. In 3 lobes, it scraped over bedrock, carving and molding you into moraines, cames, and outwash plains, as if with a sculptor's tools, but no final design in mind. In its wake, it strewed all manner of rock debris over you. Miles upon miles of till, gravel, sand, and boulders, hundreds of feet thick. But you didn't mind. You liked the way the meltwater streams dressed you, how their deposits filled your deltas and expanded west, how leftover lumps of ice melted and made jewel-like kettle holes across your peninsula. You even chose to bear your relict valleys, your riverless battle scars, with pride. You couldn't fathom then that one day you would be robed in pitch pines, marshes, and cranberry bogs, or called home by piping plovers, seals, and humans. You didn't even care about your name until the Wampanoag and the Nauset called you Turtle Island, and the British colonists Cape Cod. No, that long ago, your only care was that you were born, and to be born means to exist, and to exist means boundless possibilities. So the idea for that poem came after I visited the Cape Cod Natural History Museum in Brewster, and there's an exhibit there about how the geological history of Cape Cod, so how it was formed by glaciers many moons ago. And it's just funny where you start getting ideas for poems and the lines start and words start coming to you, and in my case, how sometimes, or a lot of the time, oh, there's a song I'm hearing in my head. I know that song. I'm going to listen to that song while I'm writing this poem. And that's how that one came to be. So, like I said, that's one of my favorite poems in the book. And I knew from the very beginning, not only because it's one of my favorites, but because it's one of the strongest, that it was going to be the one to kick off the collection. And that's sort of what you want to do when you're starting to structure a poetry collection. You always want to start the collection with one of the strongest poems. Something that's going to set the tone for the book and draw the reader in, kind of like an invitation. Or if we're comparing it to another genre, it's almost like that poem is the equivalent of the hook or the opening sentence in a fiction novel. So one of the questions I've been asked most, not since the book came out, but since people found out that my book was coming out, was how do you organize a poetry manuscript? Are there any rules, or is there a certain way of doing it? The answer is no. There are no rules, and in a way that's great because it gives you the freedom to choose how you want to structure it. And there are things that you have to consider as you're doing so, like what are the themes in your book? Does the tone change from poem to poem? Would it make more sense for certain poems to be grouped together based on those two things? In some cases, a poetry manuscript may be best formed as like a narrative arc, almost as in a fiction novel, because perhaps there's a certain chronology that it needs to follow. Or maybe there's a story that the poet wants to tell through their poems. So there are just so many different ways of doing it. And, in the back there, Libby and the rest of the library were kind enough to put together some of my favorite poetry books of all time. And if you take those books, you're going to find that there are all different ways to structure it. Sometimes there are, split into 2 sections, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, sometimes they're not split into any sections at all. It's all a matter of what each poet wants to do. And sometimes, even despite what you start off with your structure, you find later on, I didn't really think through that very well, did I? That was actually one of the, mistakes, so to speak, when I put together Wild Gardens. I tend to write a lot of poems inspired by birds. I don't know why. It just happens. But it took 2 years for Wild Gardens to get accepted by a publisher, and about a year and a half into that process, I realized that the final section of the manuscript, all but one of the bird poems were in that section of the book, and I was like, let's switch things up a little bit. So that is one thing I would be mindful of if you're putting together a poetry manuscript, is make sure you don't have too many poems in one section that are about the same exact thing. Make sure they're sort of spread out in a way that makes sense. And so when I was taking that into account to come to what is now the final way that, the final version of Wild Gardens, I came back to one of the major themes in the book. If you haven't guessed from the cover art, one of the major themes of Wild Gardens is the natural world. And I knew I wanted to have about 4 or 5 sections. And I instantly thought of the 4 natural elements. Does anybody know what the 4 natural elements are? Yes, I'm asking for audience participation. Feel free to just call them out. Fire, water, earth, air. Yes. So fire, water, air, and earth. And so, taking those ideas into account, I decided, okay, what are some poems that have literal interpretations of each of these themes? And also metaphorical interpretations, because each of those elements symbolizes different things. And so, keeping in mind more or less the metaphorical part of it to begin with, because I knew I was starting this with origin story of Cape Cod, and I felt into the tone of that poem. And this may sound a bit surprising, but I decided to go with fire as the opening section, as the theme, so to speak, for the first section of the book. And, so there are some poems in this section that deal with the literal interpretation, warmth, heat. There are some poems set in the spring and summertime, light, sunset, sunrise. But if you think about what fire symbolizes, what comes up for you? Energy.
I was also thinking destruction.
True. You don't get that so much in this one, but I can see where you're going. Does anyone think of passion when they think of fire? Also, not only destruction, but what happens after destruction? Rebirth. So new beginnings and birth. And also, if we're talking about passion, creativity. There are quite a few poems in the first section of Wild Gardens that talk about different forms of creativity. There's a poem about music. There's a poem about glass blowing, the glass blowing museum on Cape Cod. One poem is called How to Color a Mandala, because I went through a phase where I loved adult coloring books. And there's such a thing as writing poems about poetry. And that's known as an ars poetica. And these kinds of poems are, they usually use a metaphor to talk about the craft of writing poetry. So that's where this next poem comes in. And it's also the title poem, Wild Gardens. I hold ideas for poems like seeds in my hand. And there are thousands of them, waiting for the brush of the breeze, their invitation to come out and play. Of their own volition, they leap out of my palm into the air and land where they choose in the open meadow. These seeds all appear the same at first, smooth, round, black and brown, shining from the tender touch of morning light, until they each take root and grow of their own accord. Each one knows the shape it desires, an ocean of moss and ferns, a tree with a thundercloud canopy, a shrub resembling a beehive, or a burst of daylilies. And I've learned that none of them take kindly to premature guidance from pruning shears and shovels. Isn't that the truth? Instead, I let each garden become a wilderness until it tells me the time has come. Softer than birdsong, louder than a chorus, each one will whisper in my ear how it wishes to be sculpted, how it wants to be watered and fed. And while I am the caretaker of these gardens, I am not the only gardener, because they all nourish me as I nurture them, speaking to me in petals, pine needles, and exhalations as they guide me through each step of their maturation process and teach me how I too can grow. Thank you. I forgot to mention earlier that Wild Gardens is also, the poem itself is a good example of how there are certain poems in this book where different themes intersect. Like for that poem, it uses a lot of natural imagery, and so it's sort of an intersection between the natural world and creativity. And there will be a couple other poems that I'm gonna read tonight that also illustrate a similar, similar types of thematic intersections. I kind of like to think of this book as like, it has a web of themes, and everything is connected in the end. So, we're gonna move on into part 2 of Wild Gardens. So, part 1, as we said, natural elements, is fire. For part 2, I chose water. And I did that because I wanted the second section to contrast the themes and tone that appeared in the first section. And so, yes, there are some literal interpretations of the theme. For instance, there's a poem called Breath of a Humpback Whale, which I wrote after going on my first whale watch several years ago. But there are also, like with part 1, some symbolic interpretations of water. So when you think of what water might represent, what do you think of? Nourishment.
Life.
Flowing.
Life.
Flowing.
Flowing.
Cleansing.
Cleansing. And there are elements of all of that in this section. Water is also often associated with emotions. And so this was the section where I knew I wanted to introduce some of the relationship-themed poems as well. So there are some love poems in this section, a couple poems about family, poems about grief and loss as well. The poem I'm going to read next, it's a little bit of a love poem, but I think more than anything it illustrates the most important relationship that we can have in our lives. And that's our relationship with ourselves. So, self-love to a degree too. This particular poem, I wrote it after looking at one of the pictures my boyfriend took on our very first big trip together. We went to Iceland in 2021. There are quite a few Iceland poems in this book as well. One of the first pictures he took of the trip was actually at Logan Airport. We were waiting for our check-in desk to open. And he said, "Hey, turn around." And next thing I know, I'm posing for a photo. And this is what came out of it afterward. Self-portrait of the poet, looking at a photo of herself. Logan Airport, Boston, Massachusetts, September 2021. Look at my eyes and how they sparkle like tumbled aventurine behind my glasses. Everyone says my eyes are the first thing they notice about me. So did my boyfriend when we finally sat down to talk about love. He still swears my irises are the color of polished nickel. I disagree. But I won't deny that when in just the right light and at just the right angle, they glow. Soft and steady, like the headlamps we'll both wear at the lava tunnel cave tour in a few days. But right here, right now, I am at the airport, waiting with him for our check-in desk to open, glasses sweetly tilted as I look at his camera, dark brown hair half up, half falling out of the matching elastic. One hand tugging down my magenta COVID mask so I can smile for the photo, and for him. The other hand curled around the small of my back to reveal a peek of the opal promise ring he gave me 5 months ago. No pimples or chin hairs are visible, the freckles on my face too small to see from this short distance, but it's clear from the heart blush on my cheeks and the vastness of my grin that I'm thinking about the upcoming trip and not my perceived imperfections. Behind me, the waiting area at Terminal E is dim, the announcement screens and white numbers at each closed desk blurred, almost impossible to read, as the girl in the mint green shirt the girl who is me, reflects all of the room's light, like the snow I'll see atop Snæfell's Jökull in 1 week. Or perhaps I'm not reflecting light, but emitting my own, a beacon of my world and his, using lenses made of intuition that flash a message. Look at me. I am beautiful, that I am only now beginning to believe. Thank you. Whenever I read that poem, it reminds me how I've been on a journey the past several years of my life. I mean, my life changed completely from the time I started writing poems for this book to the time it came out. Traveling abroad for the first time, falling in love really for the first time, and it's funny how the book sort of chronicles that in some ways. Speaking of Iceland, this was not from that 2021 trip, but from an earlier trip, where I was on a tour and got to see a waterfall. That's the title of this poem, and it's my favorite waterfall in Iceland. Despite all the huge ones that are out there, I think this one is so, so special, and maybe because of personal reasons. And I always have to think about the Icelandic pronunciations too, because it's not always exactly how you read it. Hraunfossar, Húsafell, Iceland. What happens when you see a waterfall? Do you reach out to let its mist land on your skin? Shout of its magnificence to your other tourists? Or do you do nothing because of what stirs inside and is beyond your control? This lava falls, as it's known in Icelandic, greeted me like a friend moments ago when I stepped off the bus. Its salutation crashing like cymbals, yet hushed and rain steady. Now I follow the black soil path, reach the bend where the cliff overlooks the river, and a swell dams my throat. This waterfall is not like others. Not a tall, singular cascade, but a long, sprawling multitude. Hundreds of rivulets seeping out of the lava field into the rapids below. On and on it flows, and I stand before it, heart overflowing, because suddenly I'm not here on the cliff, but across the river, where the porous rock and the glacial melt are washing my body to the marrow, scrubbing me clean of hurts I had borne across an ocean. And my hands and fingers have spread into the ledges from which those waters leap and carry the toxins and dead cells of self away. How do you respond then, when the world becomes both healer and teacher? Do you return to a sheltered, stagnant life after this? Or do you simply go on, like the waterfall, always moving, always whispering, always persevering? Thank you. And that poem is one of the examples of the literal interpretation of water, but there's also, I think, some of the metaphorical in there too. So now we're moving into part 3. And for this section, I decided to go with the element of air as the theme. Partly because, again, I wanted it to contrast the first 2 sections of the book while threading in some of the themes that appeared earlier in the book. But I also knew that there were probably going to be some new themes coming up in this 3rd section too. And so if we think about literal interpretations of air, some of the poems that I knew needed to go in this section were a couple of the bird poems we talked about earlier. One is called Osprey at Bass River, which I wrote after watching an osprey catch fish on Cape Cod. And there's another one called Hunter's Moon, so inspired by the full moon of October. There's also variations on a tornado on Cape Cod. So I think it was the summer of 2018, 2019 when 3 EF1 triplet tornadoes touched down in the Yarmouth area of Cape Cod. One of them passed within a mile of my parents' house because they live on Cape Cod now. So that was a scary day. Now, in terms of the symbolism, when you think about what air might symbolize, what are some things that you think of?
Movement.
Hmm?
Movement.
Movement?
Freedom.
Hmm?
Freedom.
Freedom?
Breath.
Hmm?
Breath.
Breath?
Lightness.
Lightness? That all makes sense. And there are poems that touch on those themes in this section of the book. But if we're thinking about, you know how part 1 fire represented passion, and part 2 water, I was thinking about emotions. And so air is the element that is often associated with the mind. And based on that alone, I knew that this was the section where I was going to be introducing some of the poems having to do with mental health. I have experienced both depression and anxiety in the past. And when you're a poet, you can't help but write about things that, well, sometimes recent things, but also things that happened in your past. And I kind of take it as if I feel compelled to write about those topics, then it means that I am meant to be talking about them with other people. I am meant to speak about it. And so, there was no qualms about including those poems in this book because that's just, they needed to be in there. This first poem I'm going to read from part 3 is inspired by one person's experience, so therefore mine, with overthinking and anxiety that results in insomnia. 2 a.m. No, the alarm clock hasn't crowed yet. It won't for another 4 hours. You've already laid there for just as long, your head a gauntlet run of fears. Thinking, what will happen at work tomorrow, becomes, how can I manage 2 jobs? Becomes, should I cancel my plans this weekend? Becomes, did I lock my front door before bed? And all the thinking and becoming amplifies the night until the silence snarls like wolves in tangled hair, and the creak of the radiator sends you bolting upright, and the darkness blinds you, compressing you, and your face grows numb to the shield of your hands, even though you smell the lingering notes of lavender lotion, and even that fails to soothe you, and that small failure sneers at you, taunting and lying to you until you feel not like a child but an orphan, screaming soundlessly into nothingness, because even pillows and sheets can be nothingness, and on nights like these, time can be nothingness, because heaven knows you've shut your eyes and watched phosphenes slither behind your lids for hours. And then you roll over and find 2:07 a.m. staring at you, and you weep, because time should heal wounds, not reopen them anew. Thank you. It's not hard to read that poem, it's just, I know how it needs to be read. And so I always feel like I need to catch my breath afterward for that reason. Here's one. So this next poem from part 3 is one of the literal interpretations of air, with a little bit of water, I guess you could say. And it's one of the other Cape Cod poems. This was a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago. It was just my parents and I on a vacation. I think my brother was in college at the time. He wasn't there. And we were staying for a week in Chatham. And we were staying on Queen Anne Road, which is one of the roads where you can see Oyster Pond from. And one afternoon, I was at the place we were renting. Mom and Dad had gone off to do something. And I was writing. And every now and then I would look up at the window of the view of Oyster Pond, and the fog was growing thicker and thicker all afternoon. So, fog rolling in from Oyster Pond. Now it creeps in from the pond toward the shore, so leisurely that it eludes the naked eye. Only 10 minutes ago, it posed a faint and silvery threat as it hovered above the gentle waves and the marina's empty boats. Now it crawls across the abandoned beach, slithering at a patient pace, swallowing each crumb of the coastal terrain, the water's edge, the grains of sand, the thick heads of marsh grass, the vacant parking lot and outhouse, the weathered and food-stained picnic tables, the neatly trimmed rose bushes and hydrangea, and finally Queen Anne Road and the intrepid cars on her tongue. Now this elbow of land is a wraith, a turbid shroud that's wider than the great egrets who mate here in the summer, so pale yet so bright that you might swear a swarm of ghosts is approaching, and then lose your footing and your breath. Now you cannot help but gaze at the softly blinding wall, cannot help but marvel at how the sky has lowered itself to the earth, how its teeth of mist don't bite, but graze your skin in cool, sweet beads, how the embrace of its milky arms is more tender than the smothering you expected, how you subscribe to sightlessness for a moment, so you can say you've touched the clouds. Thank you. So I have 2 more poems, and the second to last one is what I'm going to be reading from part 4 of Wild Gardens. So, if part 1 was fire, part 2 was water, and part 3 was air, what element is left? Earth. And so for this earth section, so to speak, this is, I don't want to call it a catch-all section, but this is, I think, this is where most of the poems in this section of the book are inspired by the natural world. But I also knew that this was going to be the section where it would start to tie together all the other themes that appeared earlier in the book. And there are some new angles on the theme of the natural world that appear in this final section. Particularly poems about the challenges that the natural world is facing. Yes, there is, there are still poems in here that are what's beautiful and amazing about nature. But also, there are poems in this section having to do with climate change and how that's affecting, for example, the glaciers in Iceland. They're melting at a very, very rapid rate. Species loss. And like I said, as some of the poems in this book also show intersections between all the different, some of the different themes that are happening. And one of the poems that I saved, that I ended up putting in part 4, shows the intersection specifically between the natural world and mental health. I also really wanted to read this poem tonight because some of you have probably driven down the street that this poem is named after. How many people here have been to Moose Hill Wildlife Sanctuary next door in Sharon? You've driven down this street then. Moose Hill Street Lullaby. Am I awake or dreaming? Some days it's hard to know when I'm driving down this street. Winding, serpentine. For 2.5 miles, it leads me away from Route 95's chokehold of traffic as I commute to work. This morning is one such morning. It's been 3 weeks since I last slept a full night. And in these early days of autumn, the falling maple seeds remind me of the nature of my thoughts, tail spinning, but never crashing because the earth retreats farther and farther away. It's a violent vigilance, this anxiety, yet so deceptively quiet that no one knows I'm suffering, unless I tell them so. But the trees on this street, their leaves barely touched by the ochre of September, they know. So do the cows grazing in the fields, the walking paths lacing through the woods, the ivy scaling oaks and telephone poles, even the man-made things, houses new and historical, a meadow of solar panels, hissing high-tension lines. They whisper as I pass, saying, "You are safe. This is not a dream." I want so badly to linger here, to pull over the car, curl up among the roots or in a small cave, and hibernate until spring. Instead, I reach the end of the street, exhale the drowsy ache from my eyes, and know I'll be back tomorrow for more of this street's lullaby, until I remember how to sing my own again. Thank you. Yep, that sometimes Moose Hill Street was my way of just avoiding rush hour traffic when I used to work in the corporate world. So,
It's a good way to decompress anyway,
it absolutely is, especially on a street like that.
whether you slept or not.
Exactly, exactly. So, we're down to the last poem for tonight. And it's also the last poem from Wild Gardens. Now, if you open up the book, one of the things you're going to find is this final poem in the book is isolated in its own section. Now, this is not, there are other poetry books out there that do this. I don't know if there's a name for this technique or whether there's a more logical reasoning for doing it than what I'm going to give. But I just felt, first of all, I knew that this poem needed to be the final poem in the book. Partly because it's similar to the advice I gave earlier about how to kick off your collection. You want to end with one of the strongest poems. One that this time is going to act like a conclusion and is also going to stay with the reader for a long time. You want it to be a poem that's going to remind the poet of why they read the book in the first place. And I felt that by isolating this last poem in its own section, I feel it's just very representative of the whole book. There are little bits and pieces, I think, of all 4 sections that appear in here. And this is also the poem that ties back into the cover art. So this is a picture of World's End. It's a wildlife sanctuary that's run by the trustees in Hingham, so on the south shore of Massachusetts. And my boyfriend and I took a picnic lunch. Well, wait, I'm skipping ahead here. So I saw this picture in a photo gallery in Chatham about 10 years ago. And I was like, what is this place? I need to find if it's real. And and then finally my boyfriend and I went. It was my birthday in 2020, so the year of COVID when we were all, social distancing and whatnot. And we took a picnic lunch there, and afterward we walked around, explored the park. It was probably one of my favorite birthdays ever. And it was just the feel, we just read the poem because that's what it's all about in the end. At world's end. Have we come to the edge of the world? It certainly seems so here, where the farthest path follows the rim of the peninsula before circling back toward the mainland, where the wide, winding trail that beckoned us here resembles a long-abandoned, tire-worn carriage road, where a wall of oaks, maples, and catalpas shields us from the Labor Day boat traffic in the harbor beyond, and we can drink up the peace that's encouraged by the crisp shrilling of cicadas and the crunching of grass underfoot. It's the postcard image of an ending, yet on today, my birthday, I stand only in beginnings. A new year in the summer of my existence. Another year of sunlight warming my skin. Another year of living as verdantly as drumlin meadows and full leaf canopies. I look back at you now that we're standing in the shade, then at our hands, fingers intertwined like the limbs of the century-old sentinels surrounding us, then back at the fence of trees just before the shore. You could always turn around, visit the rocky beach and the tidal marsh, walk the other paths that weave through the park, but the barrier ahead can't keep out the salty heart call of the sea or hide the blue water that shimmers through the gaps between their trunks. And the burgeoning wild child in me thinks, what if there was no edge of the world? What if you and I or anyone could defy the name of this sanctuary? Would you come with me, follow me, if I tugged on your hand to see what lies on the other side? Would you walk through that doorway to the sky, the ocean, the future, then find your footsteps quickening until you're running because your blood flows hot and blazing bright like sunlight? How far would you go? What paths would you find? Would it feel like heaven or a little bit like home? Let's find out, shall we? Thank you. So, I would like to open this up to some Q&A now. So, if you have any questions about the poems or the book itself, publishing, or right, or anything else, what would you? Feel free to ask.
Okay, Sarah.
Yes, Deb.
I will ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
You've written these poems over a whole period of time, right?
Yes.
So when you were constructing this, it just all seemed like a lot of work.
It's not easy putting
Try
together a
to
poetry collection.
Figure out and analyze and dissect. Was it a lot of work?
Well, I mean, considering that I did it twice, you know, it can be. I mean, because it is something you have to give a lot of thought to. It's not like it's probably the same process that like musicians go through when they're trying to figure out the track listing for an album. So like, what song's got to go first? What's got to end? Where do the other tracks go? What's the best flow? So there's a little bit of that has to go into the process. I mean, I guess I could have, you know, an easy way of doing it would have been like, oh yeah, this is sort of the order in which I wrote them in, but I'm not, you know, that might not work for every collection. And to a degree, some of the selections were also intuitive. It wasn't, you know, like, you know, sometimes I find that I can't think too much about it. It's like, okay, once I knew the 4 sections and what the general themes were going to be, it's like, okay, where's the best fit for everything based on what each section is gonna what its themes are going to be and also what the tone will probably be. So yeah, I mean, it can be work. Like I said, I made a mistake, I made mistakes the first time, but that's part of the learning process. Yes?
So how much does the publisher help you put that together, or you put it together and, or do they make suggestions around that, or how did that?
So I think that differs from publisher to publisher. That being said, they do want to see that the manuscript is pretty much done when they receive it. So my publisher for this book is Kelsey Books, which is a press based out in Utah, who has published work by other poets who are in this room as well. I mean, they publish a lot of poetry books every year, and they really didn't have many editorial changes, both in terms of individual edits within the poems, as well as the overarching structure. Other publishers might be different. I think is particularly with poetry, most of the time, the publisher, one of the reasons why the publisher is going to accept your book to begin with is because they like not only the poems themselves, but how it's constructed for the most part. So the structure and the flow of it as well. So I think that's something that they take into account when they see the whole collection. And it might be possible sometimes that they may suggest moving some poems, but I don't really know if that's something that happens very often. Yes?
Last question. Now, this came from you, your heart, like giving birth to a child, right?
Sort of, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it came from within.
Yes.
Did you find it difficult, and did they even try to edit your poem?
Oh, my publisher? No. No, they made no changes whatsoever.
Do they ever?
I think it depends on the press that you're working with. But I think most of the time, like I said with the answer to the previous question, they're not going to try to edit you if they accept your work. I mean, if they're not totally happy with it, they're probably not going to say yes to it to begin with. So I think most of the time, particularly with poetry, if they say yes to the work, it's not just the book itself, but it's also the poet and the things that they have to say in it as well. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
sure. I just know, I was thinking it must be very hard when you created this entity and then have someone come and pick it apart and say, do this or that.
No, that
Or
really.
wasn't the way you did it or saw it.
No, that did not happen at all.
I've known publishers that like to do that.
I think
A
that.
whole lot with novels.
And I think
You get
that's
it more with
where
prose.
it tends to happen most is in fiction. Probably fiction most, and then perhaps nonfiction. Poetry, I really don't think it happens very much.
And Kelsey is a small press. I do small press publishing. The really big presses, you get the editorial team that's going to go after your thing. Says with small presses, not so much. You get the same type of thing.
Yeah. You had a question, Ray Daniel, and you had a question back there too.
So now that you are one of the premier poets in Southern New England.
I don't know if I would say
Okay.
that,
Oh,
but
I
okay,
know.
thank you.
We all know. I saw it this safely again. Do you have any input or advice you give to people who are thinking, gee, I'd really like to do this. I'd like to put a book together. I'd like to start getting my stuff out there. What would you tell them?
Go for it.
Anything
No.
more specific?
No, because there's a lot of fear sometimes in the process. Because, especially if you're interested in getting your work published in literary journals and magazines and anthologies, it's not that poets try to make it competitive, but there's a lot of work that's being submitted to potential places for publication. And so it's competitive only in that way because the publishers and the editors are receiving so much work that they sometimes have to be selective about what they're choosing. And, you know, I still experience rejections when I'm sending out work for a potential book too. I shouldn't say potential because I'm probably most of the way there already, which is just mind-boggling. But you never know. It's never going to happen to you. You're never going to get your work published if you don't submit it. You have to try. It may take a while. It took me 5 years to get my first acceptance for poetry from a literary journal, and that poem is actually in here. And you're still gonna, even after you start getting acceptances, you're still gonna get rejections now and then. A lot of the time, some poets or like short story writers aim to get 100 rejections every year. I don't know how you manage to keep track of just the rejection part and not just how many you're sending out, period. But you have to try. You have to be willing to try, because you never know what could happen if things do work out. And so it also ends up being a process over time of being patient and waiting for the responses, persisting through all the no's and rejections and any negative feedback you get, which you really don't get that much, at least I haven't experienced that much. And then over time, it's just, you never know unless you try. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, is poetry your main genre that you like or write in?
So poetry is the main genre that I write in, but it's not the only one that I read. I mean, I do have I'm maybe reading 3 poetry books in an anthology at any given time. I literally take my poetry collections one poem at a time. But I also read, I also read some fiction and nonfiction as well, partly because I've always had a wide range in tastes in reading, and that sort of has transferred over into the work that I do as a book editor and writing coach. But in terms of what I write, it's poetry right now. I wouldn't say no to writing fiction or nonfiction at some point, but this is just what's worked out best for me over time. And also there's a genre that I've gotten a lot of fulfillment out of. B? Stephanie, and then, yes.
You've touched on your second book, but can you give us a little glimpse into it?
So yes, it contains a lot of the same themes that are in Wild Gardens, but there are also going to be some new ones as well. And I think sort of like with Wild Gardens and how it showed like my growth, or the journey that that life took me on, roughly from 2017 to 2021. This book is more recent. It's going to be a bit more international because I've had the opportunity to visit other countries the past few years. There's other emotional and to a degree psychological territory that I've had to process the past couple of years, and it's going to be interesting when the time comes to start putting together this manuscript, because I think it's going to mean some interesting decisions about what to include and what I feel uncomfortable including at this time in my life. I know I'm being a little bit vague there, but it's also because there's still a little ways to go before I think I'm ready, but my boyfriend keeps an Excel spreadsheet of all my poems, and so he keeps track. And he was very disappointed that he couldn't be here tonight, because otherwise he would be. But so he keeps track of, you know, where we are for like book 2, and he was like, you know, at the rate you're going, you might be ready to start like submitting this thing to publishers in a year from now, which is like, what? So, you're welcome.
It's good to have that organization.
Well, I've told people that he does that. Like, is he an engineer? I go, yes, and they're like, that explains it.
Yin and yang.
Steph.
Did you always know you wanted to be a writer when you grew up?
Oh, yes. Yes. I remember being 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen island writing stories. I mean, and I've dabbled in different kinds of writing throughout my life, but the first time I really remember writing poetry, I was probably like 10, 11 years old. And what else? I mean, during that time, I was also like writing. I wrote in school newspapers, like the ones at Foxboro High and at the Ahern, because I was at the Ahern at one for middle school. I continued I continued writing through college. I thought at one point I was going to be in journalism, and then 2008 happened. But life took me on a different direction work-wise. Continually just doing all, going back and forth between like fiction and poetry in particular, until I really realized, you know what, I'm actually getting traction, and some of my work is being published in poetry, and I have the most ideas and the most drive for it right now, so maybe this is where I need to place my focus for a while. Like I said earlier, if something comes to me that's fiction, or maybe even some kind of nonfiction that I feel inspired to work on, I'll do it at some point, but when the time is right. Yes?
I'm a retired engineer. I've worked with spreadsheets, and I have a T-shirt that says "Overthinking in Progress." I relate to the poem. I've written a whole bunch of poems, and it's kind of morphed into an autobiography. It's poems and stories that I'm likely going to go with Amazon just to get more in terms of royalties to raise money.
Understood.
Donating some of the profits to fight cancer kind of thing.
Nice.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on a few things. Should I have an LLC, as a self-employment thing, websites to promote it?
Okay, now I'm stepping into book coach. And my book coach hat is getting a little bit here. I don't necessarily think you need to have an LLC, especially when you're starting off, because LLCs are typically recommended, and this just comes from my business background from when I was thinking about, like getting ready to launch my business several years ago. It's really recommended when you're consistently making like a certain amount of money, and I don't remember what that threshold is off the top of my head. In terms of website, that I do recommend, just because you do want to have a single space, so to speak, for people to go to, so they can learn more about you and the story, and your, I shouldn't say stories, your book and whatnot. In terms of other things like social media and whatnot, that's entirely up to you. Just because not everybody's comfortable with that. And I don't like to push writers to do things that they're not comfortable with. It's not that they're not comfortable with it, but it's not a good fit for them. And so part of that, I think, comes down to what feels like it's going to be the right fit for you in terms of putting yourself and your book out there. And autobiography and memoir written in poems, I have heard of that before. And I think it's really, and I think that's a really cool idea. And I have a book in mind to recommend to you. So it's called Self-Publishing Simplified. Disclaimer, it's one of the books I edited. But it's honestly, I remember reading it when I was copy editing it and just saying, this is a really good resource, like a one-stop shop, so to speak, for authors who want to self-publish, but they don't really know how to go about the process. And the author does recommend certain services in there. I think she talks about Amazon because it is the biggest in terms of self-publishing. But there are other things in there, like other types of service providers that she recommends for other aspects of the self-publishing process. And everything that she mentions are things that she's either done herself or that she recommends, because either she liked it or other self-published authors she knows like it. So any of the resources that she recommends in her book are reputable. So she really does simplify the process. So it's called Self-Publishing Simplified, and the author's name is Kristen Kiefer. And I think Kieffer, yes. And I think it's helpful to authors of any genre, really. You're welcome.
Would you also suggest maybe he join like a local poetry
Oh, of
group?
course.
Say that.
Of course.
Beat you to it, lady.
Because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the other things I do is I'm one of the co-hosts and the co-founders of the Pour Me a Poem Open Mic, which is in Mansfield, Massachusetts.
This Thursday.
In fact, Wayne Daniel over here, he is the other co-founder and co-host. And we have it at his house. We set it up in his living room.
51 Park Street, it's called, in Mansfield. Okay?
Is it every Thursday?
It's the second Thursday of the month.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that one of the ways, if you're looking to, once you self-publish and sell your books and so forth, is to go to meetings and read. You have to be, there's an open mic,
Yeah.
and then eventually people ask you to be a feature.
Yeah, I've actually been to a number of them.
So please come to ours.
Yes.
What was the address again?
51 Park Street.
Yes, so,
Do you know Mansfield at all?
I used to deliver papers.
so I'm just gonna,
You know what Park Street is?
so I'm gonna repeat this information. So Pour Me a Poem is held on the second Thursday of every month at 51 Park Street in Mansfield, Massachusetts.
7 o'clock.
So the next one is this Thursday, April 10th, at 7 p.m. And we always kick off each Pour Me a Poem with a featured poet who reads for 20 to 25 minutes. This month's featured poet is Miriam O'Neill, who is the Poet Laureate of Plymouth. And then it's followed by the open mic. And so we are happy to have new poets come to read, well, I shouldn't say new poets, but new to us poets come to join our community and read and read their work. Each of these events are free, but sometimes people sell books, and so I would always recommend bringing a little bit of money in case you want to buy anybody's books, and support the features with a donation during the event. I meant to say this earlier, I have an email list that I've got going for tonight. If you would like to sign up to either be on the Pour Me a Poem email list, we only send messages a couple times a month just as reminders for when the next open mic is happening. Or if you also want to sign up for my newsletter to get updates, find out where else I'm going to be reading. Because as Wayne Daniel likes to say, Sara Letourneau is doing her own Eras tour.
And very well deserved.
So, yes, like I said, we have an email list, so feel free to sign up and, just leave a note as to whether you want to be on Pour Me a Poem or on my email list.
And Pour Me a Poem has a Facebook page too.
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Quick one,
Yes.
in terms of the format, do you have like a time limit of how much?
It depends on how many poets are there reading. Some nights we can have as many as 15 to 18 poets.
We've had 2023 in there.
Well, I think it's 2012. We also get a lot of poet supporters, so like
Yeah.
poetry
That's true, too.
fans. So you don't have to be a poet to come to Pour Me a Poem. If you
Right.
want to come and just support the local poetry community and meet other poets and just generally feel inspired, this is a wonderful event to come to.
Very
So we
well.
recommend it to anybody who wants to have more poetry in their life.
Did you have like feedback, or probably not because you
Not
have so many
really,
poets?
no, I
But
mean,
people get together during the break and talk
yeah,
to each other.
yeah, or
And I
like
think
out.
certain friendships groups have kind of grown and they've created groups that get
Yeah.
together.
Mhm.
So it's a good networking.
Yeah,
type
so
of
it
thing.
is great networking, and like sometimes people may come up to you afterward, or like you can even put it out there, like when you go up to read a poem, like if you want feedback on your poem,
Sure.
not necessarily right after you read, but like after the open mic is done, I'm sure people would be some of the poets in the room would be happy to speak to you about it afterward.
People linger, we have drinks and
Snacks and
stuff,
goodies.
sure. And it's interesting because this has been going on for over 2 years now, right?
Yes.
Right. We started because there was nothing in the area to go to. You had to go to Boston or Plymouth or Worcester.
Yeah.
There was no readings.
Yeah.
So we
Just
said,
to-
let's start our own.
Yeah.
And
So when we started, Wayne Daniel and I, we knew each other beforehand, but because he used to be the one of the editors for Soul Lit, an online literary magazine, and he accepted some of my work for publication. And at one point we realized, in fact, I think it was Moose Hill Street Lullaby,
yes.
which you published, that we were next door neighbors, and so we finally met in the summer of 2022, and at that time, I mean, there were some things that were going on poetry-wise, like in our area, before COVID, and they pretty much disappeared after like after a couple years into the pandemic, and so that's why we started Pour Me a Poem, was to fill a void. And I mean, yes, a lot of local poets come. We also do get poets from sometimes coming from the South Shore, sometimes coming from the Worcester area, all friends of ours who have, it's funny how people, once you know that they know you have an event, that they want to come and support you.
We have all contingent of Worcester folk to come out.
We do have a good contingent of Worcester folk who come out.
Open mics
Yeah,
all
sure.
across the state.
Mhm.
And what's really interesting is, over these years, a number of people that come regularly now have books
Yes.
out.
Mhm.
It seems to just generate the energy.
It's-
and sometimes
there's-
and people feel
The confidence to do
affirmed
it.
in their poetry.
Yeah.
They can put it together. They can. So we've had 4 or 5, anyway, more.
Yeah, I mean,
Your brother.
I mean, I'm one of them.
I'm one of them.
I mean, it was, during around the first anniversary of Pour Me a Poem that I found out that this had been accepted. So, it's so much of our poetry community
It's
has
great that way.
has flourished in the time that we started
about
Pour Me a
poetry.
Poem, and it's been pretty amazing to see that.
That group support is so important.
Yeah.
It really is. It really, really is, and just how it expands your network, and then you find about all these other open mics, and you start going to those as well.
Yeah.
It's just
It's just, my wife in my living room. Now it's a big, big house. You'll see. There's lots of room, but people feel, I think, very non-threatened to go to read. We had a young lady and a couple of friends used to come up from Stonehill. They're 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, and now she has a book out.
Last month you had, what was she, 17 years old girl?
Yes,
who
from
got
high
up and
school.
read? Yeah.
Of course, this is this is me. I talk everybody. So I got to know the Dunkin' Donuts line every morning. And we talk about poetry, and you should really come. So she showed up. She showed up at the house.
Mhm.
Wonderful, and so it's just a wonderful community, and really great for, like I said, it seems to generate books.
Mhm.
So
You don't have to sell them anymore.
I didn't mean to sound
Oh.
it's It's been a marvel, much more than we ever thought
Yeah,
it would be.
a lot of
you know?
people, quite a few people who regularly come to our open mic keep telling us that it's one of their favorites. And how grateful they are that we, how warm and inviting they find it to be, and how grateful they are that we started it. So, it's a joy to have it every month. So, like I said, we invite all of you to come join us, this month and any future ones too.
Second Thursday of every month. And it's hard to find venues for these things. It really is. I was at one at a bookstore, but it's noisy, and there's a cafe and it's noisy. Yeah. But this is just in our homes, and that's quiet.
Mm-hmm.
You do your thing.
Mm-hmm.
Don't have to worry about competing with the cappuccino machine.
Right.
I think you're reading in the lounge at Logan Airport.
Any other questions?
This is more
Yes.
comment than a
Yes.
question on a couple of the poems. And I've heard some other poetry about Cape Cod, have
Mhm.
never heard it from that perspective. That's fantastic.
Isn't
Thank
she
you.
amazing?
Yes.
She is amazing.
Second, what a wonderful end poem for this collection that World's End was.
I knew from the beginning that was going to be how it would end. Well, not from the beginning, but once it was written and I was happy with it, and it had been accepted for publication, I said, I know where that's going in
Oh
the
my
book.
gosh, and just not just the concept of the title and everything else, but just the openness at the end.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
The journey is just beginning.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
And third comment, and then I'll shut up. I applaud your courage to not just include, but also write from the perspective of some mental health issues. So important, so well done. Any
Thank
of
you.
us who have ever had insomnia on that particular one, man, oh man, does that resonate. But I applaud you
Yeah,
for
that's
that.
vulnerability to put
Yeah.
those ones out there.
Mm-hmm. No,
And
well,
it's so critical.
thank you. It really is. It really is. And I'm in a much better place with it right now. A lot of these the poems in Wild Gardens, like what talk about mental health, were really before I started, or right at the beginning of when I was starting to make some changes to my life to help with that which really, really have. It also really helps to have a boyfriend or spouse or partner who is very chill, who does not overthink things the way you do, and sort of reminds you to be calm and gentle with yourself, and
Gives you that balance.
so
Well,
thank you.
That's great.
I think poetry just invites vulnerability to begin with.
Right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
for sure.
I think you're right.
Yes. I think we are two more? Okay.
I just, as much as anything, a comment, you mentioned a spouse who's sort of to counterbalance. My wife, she goes by the Nike motto, just do it. I'm the one that researches and
plan
overthinks.
it.
Mhm.
Just do it.
Yeah. Research is good, but action, things don't get done if you don't act. That's for sure. Anything else? No? Well, like we've mentioned earlier, I've got the email list that if you want to sign up to, receive reminders about Pour Me a Poem, or if you want to sign up for my newsletter, for tips about writing, and also find out where else I'm going to be reading in the coming weeks and months. I've got the sign-up list over there. I have copies of Wild Gardens available for sale tonight. It's $23 a book, and I'm very happy to sign them as well. As Libby mentioned earlier as well, Wild Gardens is also available to borrow from Boyden Library. So if that's a better option for you, you can always do that too, or you can recommend people checking it out at the library. I would also recommend, again, checking out some of the books on the back table, from some of my all-time favorite poets. We've got Mary Oliver up there, Amy Nezuko Matathil, Ada Limon, who's finishing up her her tenure as the U.S. Poet Laureate this month. I think there is also books by Joy Harjo and Dorianne Lux up there. So again, all my favorite poets. And one last reminder that if you are interested in doing this and you have the extra dollars that you want to contribute, feel free to put in a donation to Boyden Library and the Friends of Boyden Library to show your support for this amazing place here in town. I think that's everything. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
So let me go over to the table.
My brother's first couple of books were Amazon. That was just the easiest way to do it. And then since been published other places, so.
We celebrate all the time, right? I will get your contact from Sara. Wonderful, thank you.
The big publisher, I went and asked them, I said, I just want to raise money.
Yeah.
I don't care about awards, any literary stuff. Do we have?
I didn't mean to oversell for you.
Oh, no, it's just, no, it's all right.
It is a great, it's like I said, I'm not into